Hi everyone, this is Tanvir Nasir welcoming you to another episode of Leadership Biz Cafe, brought to you by Tanvir Nasir Leadership, our leadership firm that now offers both virtual as well as in-person leadership keynotes and workshops on a variety of topics. So if you've been enjoying the insights and observations I've been sharing here on my podcast and would like to learn more about my speaking work, please do drop me a line through our contact form at tanvirnasir.com. Now, for this episode, I want to address a challenge many of us were warned to expect and are now beginning to see the first signs of, namely that second wave of the COVID-19 pandemic. Here in Canada, there's little doubt now that this second wave has landed on our shores, with our various provincial governments looking at what measures they need to take to reduce the impact of this second wave. Of course, while many of us are naturally focused on how big the impact of this second wave will be, the fact is, there can be no denying now that the COVID-19 pandemic will not simply be a bad memory of 2020, but instead will be both a long-term health and economic crisis whose effects and consequences will take several years to recover from. Back in episode 55 of my podcast, I looked at 3 lessons on crisis management leaders should learn from this global pandemic. And as many of us now prepare, or at least try to prepare, for what fallout may come from this second wave of COVID-19, I wanted to address another area of this global pandemic leaders need to consider and be mindful of, and that is how it impacts our critical thinking skills. Now, earlier in the year, when many countries put various lockdown measures in place to limit the spread of this virus, many of us saw online articles touting how the various stay-at-home measures should be treated as a golden opportunity to expand our horizons, citing such examples as how Newton came up with his theory of gravity while working from home during the Great Plague of London. And yet, developmental neuropsychologist Dr. Mary Colvin has challenged this assumption, stating how most of us are more likely suffering from what she calls brain fog, where the chronic stress arising from the current pandemic not only leads to time warps, where our sense of the present is stretched out, but our attention becomes limited to looking out for threats as our complex thinking skills go offline. As Dr. Colvin points out, in times of chronic stress, our brains habituate to the fight or flight response. Our awareness of worries may fade, but they continue to capture our attentional resources, making it harder to concentrate and fully observe our environment. At the same time, we may be more distractible, jumping from one thing to the next, unknowingly searching for signs of threat. Some incoming information will be missed, creating little holes in our everyday memory. We may make errors in decision-making or become stuck in old thought patterns. Now, add to this the fact that the current pandemic has disrupted our usual routines, whether that be working remotely or employing social distancing measures, wearing a mask, and regularly washing our hands with disinfectant wherever we go. And it shouldn't be too surprising that many of us are struggling with a distracted mindset that naturally impedes our ability to think critically and focus on what matters most. So in light of the prevailing uncertainties facing all industries, not just in the short term, but also in the long term, how can leaders boost their critical thinking skills while dealing with the chronic stress that impairs our complex thinking skills, including our decision-making and planning skills? Well, that's what I wanted to address in this episode of my leadership podcast, as I do believe there is a growing need for us to recognize the importance of boosting our critical thinking skills in light of this brain fog Dr. Colvin describes that COVID-19 has clearly given rise to. As such, here are 3 steps you can take to boost your critical thinking skills during this global health pandemic. The first step is to schedule what I call thinking time in your work week. Now, one of the biggest work impacts to come from the current health pandemic has been a disruption to our everyday work routines. With so many of us now working from home, those usual activities we do in our workspaces have been replaced with new ones. Some good and some not so good. Of course, One of the challenges this creates is making sure we're focusing our attention and efforts on what matters most. And as the quote I shared from Dr. Colvin points out, this is easier said than done when we're in a state of chronic stress. As such, the first step you need to take here is to literally schedule thinking time in your work week, which admittedly is now both easier and harder to do. It's easier to do now as we have more control over how we spend our days because of the fact that so many of us are still working from home. But that's also the reason why it's also harder for us to do as a result of the numerous distractions found in our homes that we're not used to tuning out. And yet, if you want to successfully dig yourself out of that brain fog and boost your critical thinking skills, you need to make time to exercise your brain. In much the same way many people are making sure to schedule time to exercise to avoid spending their days just sitting on the couch or at the kitchen table working away on their laptop. The second step to boosting your critical thinking skills during this global health crisis is to go for a walk to get some quiet time. When my hometown Montreal was put under lockdown to slow the spread of COVID-19 this past spring, one of the things I did a lot was to go for a walk around my neighborhood. I usually picked times when I knew most of my neighbors wouldn't be out so as to limit any contact I had, and with those who were out, I made sure to keep at least 2 meters distance between us. The reason I went out for these walks was not only to give myself something to do, but it also gave me that quiet space to simply think. And frankly, it's what I attribute to why I've been continuing to churn out new articles for my leadership blog and release new episodes of this podcast when so many of my colleagues started to wind down releasing new content for their audience. Similarly, when it comes to boosting your critical thinking skills, it's important that you make time to go out for walks to not just give you that quiet time critical thinking requires, but to also give you a change of scenery that actually aids with this process. In fact, studies have shown that going for walks can not only improve your ability to focus, but it can actually boost your creative problem-solving skills. At the very least, it gives you a chance to take a break from all the negative news surrounding the COVID-19 pandemic and enjoy some fresh air. And speaking of fresh air, the third step to boosting your critical thinking skills during this COVID-19 pandemic is to breathe deeply. Whether you're out for a walk or at home in front of your laptop, scientists have discovered that how you breathe can actually impact the way you think and feel, both of which have an impact on your critical thinking skills. Researchers at Northwestern University conducted a series of experiments that demonstrated that inhaling through our nose stimulates areas of our brain associated with memory processing and decision-making more than inhaling through our mouth does. In fact, the researchers found that inhaling through our nose when absorbing new information actually allows us to better retain that information. Several studies have already shown how deep breath exercises can help reduce stress levels and calm our emotional state, something that's no doubt needed in this stressful time. But what this study also demonstrates is how paying attention to how we breathe can also help activate areas of our brain that will boost our critical thinking skills by improving our memory, decision-making, as well as our emotional state. So, now when you think about going out to get some fresh air, make sure you pay attention to how you're breathing in that outdoor air, as taking in some deep breaths can do a whole world of good, provided you're staying socially distant from others, of course. As much as we'd all like to know when this global pandemic will finally end and we can return to some new form of normalcy that doesn't require social distancing measures, masks, and hand disinfectants, the simple truth is that no one at this point knows for certain how long we'll have to be at this, or when we'll finally beat this virus once and for all. And yet, our ability to think critically is like a lighthouse shining a light through the fog of uncertainty COVID-19 has created, helping us find our way to safety and better times. And there's little doubt that now is the time when we need leaders in all areas of society, both within the public and private realms, to not only be that voice of reassurance that we will collectively find a way through the storm and reach that safe harbor, but who will help us transform the way we work and live so as to improve the opportunities and experiences had by all under their care. As I said at the beginning of this episode, many of us are now having to deal with the realities of a resurgence in COVID-19 infections, both at home and in countries where we typically do business. And this will have a tangible impact on our work, if not also creating more uncertainty for what's to come. As such, I wanted to share with you these 3 steps you can take right now to boost your critical thinking skills. Skills that are becoming increasingly critical to how successful you'll be in your leadership. As I've pointed out in past episodes, I'm now sharing these kinds of insights and observations on challenges and issues leaders are facing right now in many of the leadership talks and even workshop facilitations I've been doing virtually as of late. So if you're gaining some clarity and value on how to improve your leadership during these challenging times through these episodes on my podcast, why not drop me a line through my contact form at tanvidnasir.com so we can discuss how I delve deeper into these ideas and insights in order to help your team and organization not just survive, but thrive in these uncertain times. Now, if you've enjoyed this or previous episodes of my leadership podcast, I'd appreciate it if you could share it with your network. The easiest way to do this is to simply share a link to our podcast page at tanvidnasir.com/LBC. On our podcast page, you can listen to every episode of our show, as well as get links to subscribe to my podcast on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, and Google Podcasts, so you can catch our latest episodes as soon as they're released. And with that, I'm Tanvid Nasir, and you've been listening to Leadership Biz Cafe.